Can Colombia hope to end its fight against insurgents? In 2016, a historic peace agreement ended a 50-year armed campaign by far-left guerrillas that had ravaged the country. However, while the deal was hailed as a huge breakthrough, the country still remains severely affected by violence. This was highlighted in August 2024 when the Colombian government announced that it had restarted armed operations against another of the country's main insurgent groups. So, what lies behind Colombia's violence, and just what will it take to ever stop it? Hello and welcome. If you're new to the channel, my name is James Ker-Lindsay, and here I take an informed look at international relations, conflict, security and statehood. Around the world, many countries face armed insurgencies. While some are nationalist groups fighting for independence or union with another country, others are religious or political organisations attempting to overthrow a government. Although these groups can sometimes achieve their goal, more usually they're eventually defeated or else lose support and disappear. However, occasionally the sides will reach a formal peace agreement that ends the violence. But even this is rarely the end of the story. Aside from the almost inevitable problems of implementing a deal, there'll often be rejectionists and spoilers, dissident groups that want to continue the fight. A good example is Colombia. In 2016, a peace agreement appeared to end one of the world's longest-running insurgencies. However, since then, violence has continued. The Republic of Colombia is in the northwest corner of South America. Venezuela and Brazil lie to its east, Peru and Ecuador to its south, and Panama to its north. It also has Pacific and Atlantic coastlines. Colombia's population is approximately 51 million, making it the third most populous country in Latin America. Its annual per capita GDP stands at around $6,000. However, the country has considerable inequality. 40% of the population lives below the poverty line, reaching almost 70% in the country's poorest region. Colombia has a long and rich history predating European colonisation. However, our story starts with the arrival of Spanish explorers in 1499. Searching for gold and other precious resources, they founded the city of Bogotá, high in the Andes, in 1538. This would become the capital of the new Kingdom of Granada, a part of the Viceroyalty of Peru, one of the top-level Spanish imperial provinces in the Americas. In 1717, the empire was reorganised and Bogotá became the capital of the Viceroyalty of New Granada, incorporating present-day Colombia, Venezuela, Ecuador and Panama. However, by the late 18th century, discontent was growing. In addition to the oppressed indigenous people who'd often been forced into hard labour, opposition to Spanish rule was growing amongst artisans and traders unhappy at the high levels of taxation. In 1810, a full-scale war to end Spanish rule broke out under the South American revolutionary leader Simón Bolívar. 9 years later, in 1819, Spain was defeated and the Viceroyalty became independent as the Republic of Colombia, or Gran Colombia as it's now known. However, from the start, the new state was unstable, and in 1830 it broke apart as Venezuela and Ecuador became independent. Initially becoming the Republic of New Granada, the remaining territory was renamed the United States of Colombia in 1863, before finally becoming the Republic of Colombia in 1886. By the late 19th century, Colombia was increasingly shaped by intense rivalry between two political parties, the Conservatives and the Liberals. While the former favoured a strong central government and close ties to the Catholic Church, the latter was driven by decentralisation, secularism and social reform. This often led to violent conflicts, including a civil war, the Thousand Days' War, between 1899 and 1902. A period that saw Colombia lose Panama, which became independent in 1903 with the support of the United States. In 1930, 3.5 decades of Conservative Party rule ended and the Liberals took power. But despite this, the political unrest continued. This would come to a head in 1948 when a Liberal candidate for the presidency was assassinated and the country again descended into another civil war. In 1958, after 10 years of fighting that's estimated to have cost up to 300,000 lives, the two parties agreed on a power-sharing arrangement. But while this would go on to ease the political factionism that had blighted Colombia for so many decades, the Civil War had laid the foundations for an entirely new period of conflict. The extreme brutality of the 1950s heightened many of the long-standing social and economic divisions in Colombia. As armed gangs roamed the countryside, attacking villages and murdering farmers, many communities formed self-defense groups. Crucially, many of these groups continued even after the end of the Civil War. Becoming increasingly vocal about the plight of the rural poor, who was seen as forgotten by the central government, they began to adopt Marxist-Leninist revolutionary ideology. In 1964, several united to form a new body, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, the FARC. At first, the fighting was relatively low level. Calling for land redistribution and greater social justice for rural communities, throughout the 1960s and 70s, the group conducted relatively small-scale guerrilla warfare against the Colombian armed forces in outlying areas. However, by the start of the 1980s, things were changing dramatically. Although the group initially opposed the country's expanding drug trade, it soon saw a chance to fund its operation by taxing producers. As its revenues grew, it expanded significantly, becoming a well-armed and highly organised insurgent army. By the 1990s, the FARC had dramatically increased the number and intensity of its attacks, pushing back government forces in many areas. By the late 1990s, it was clear that the FARC couldn't be beaten by military means. As a result, and following successful talks with smaller groups, the government began a peace process. However, while the negotiations continued for almost 2 years, they eventually collapsed due to ongoing violence and mistrust. Ultimately, the turning point came in 2010 with the election of a new president, Juan Manuel Santos. Although he'd taken a tough position against the FARC when he'd served as defence minister, once in power, he prioritised peace talks. 2 years later, negotiations got underway in Cuba, supported by Norway, Chile and Venezuela. The talks focused on 5 main areas: the disarmament and reintegration of FARC members, political participation for the FARC, rural development, tackling drug trafficking and addressing victims' rights and justice. 4 years later, in September 2016, the sides reached an historic agreement. In return for a range of economic, political and social measures to be introduced by the government, the FARC would disarm and become a fully fledged political party. Just weeks later, on the 2nd of October 2016, the plan was put to a nationwide referendum. However, despite widespread international support, it was narrowly defeated, with 50.2% voting against the deal. Undeterred, the sides negotiated small changes to the agreement and put it to the Colombian parliament for approval, while a major faction boycotted the vote, arguing that it gave too much to the FARC. The deal was overwhelmingly approved by the parliament. After 5 decades of fighting, the conflict appeared to be over, and later that same year, Santos was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. While the agreement marked a historic step towards peace, reconciliation and long-term stability in Colombia, it certainly wasn't the end of the story. First, and is often the case in these situations, difficulties arose over implementation. For example, there were problems regarding the reintegration of combatants. Likewise, there were complaints that key elements of the deal tackling deep-rooted problems and social inequalities weren't being put into action by the government. But while this led to tensions, the peace nevertheless held. However, a far bigger problem concerned dissident factions within the FARC that turned their back on peace and resumed fighting. The most significant of these groups is Segunda Marquetalia. Led by former FARC commanders who'd initially supported the peace process but later renounced it, it argued that the government had failed to keep up its promises. Taking advantage of the power vacuums in rural areas where government control remained weak after the FARC's disbandment, they continued their insurgency, as well as targeting security forces, community leaders and former FARC members. They also engaged in crime to fund their operations, including drug trafficking, illegal mining and extortion. However, while international attention focused on the FARC and its breakaway elements, numerous other groups continue to operate. As well as other left-wing insurgent groups, this included right-wing paramilitaries and criminal organisations. Indeed, with reports that they have been growing, it's estimated that nearly 10 million people continue to be affected by the country's ongoing violence. As a result, in early 2023, just months after assuming office, the new Colombian president, Gustavo Petro, announced a series of unilateral ceasefires with different groups. This is part of what's been called a total peace strategy. But while this has led to some tentative signs of progress, including a July 2024 ceasefire with Segunda Marquetalia and the recent announcement of possible talks with the 5,000-strong Clan del Golfo, or ACG, Colombia's largest criminal gang, there have nevertheless been some notable setbacks. Perhaps the most significant of these is the news that military operations have again resumed against the ELN, the National Liberation Army, now widely seen as the largest and most prominent of the continuing left-wing insurgencies. Like the FARC, the ELN emerged in the 1960s as a revolutionary communist group. However, unlike the FARC, it refused to participate in the peace talks under Santos. It also criticised the 2016 deal, arguing that it didn't do enough for impoverished rural communities. With an estimated 3,000 to 5,000 fighters, it instead continued its insurgency, also taking advantage of the FARC peace agreement to move into new areas. However, following the government's announcement of the unilateral ceasefire in early 2023, the ELN agreed to talks with the government. But while this eventually led to an extended cessation of fighting and even a first agreement, the sides remained at odds on several key issues, including the group's designation as a terrorist organisation. In the end, amidst mutual claims of bad faith, the ceasefire broke down. As a result, and in a blow to peace hopes, the Colombian defence minister announced at the start of August that military operations had resumed against the ELN. Quite what this will mean in real terms is unclear at the moment. Many will no doubt hope that another ceasefire can be arranged and that talks will soon resume. In the meantime, the resumption of military operations against the ELN highlights the degree to which even the most successful conflict resolution processes will inevitably be rejected by groups that, for whatever reason, want to continue the armed fight. It also underscores the enormous challenges of achieving total peace in Colombia, as well as negotiating ceasefires and eventually peace agreements with many different groups. It also means addressing the short, medium and long-term issues that form the basis of the violence. This ranges from ensuring the safety of former combatants to tackling rural development, social inequality, criminality and political exclusion. More to the point, almost a decade after the most potent of Colombia's guerrilla organisations laid down its arms, and notwithstanding the significant progress that's been made in tackling the country's various armed groups, the end of the ceasefire with the ELN once again highlights Colombia's seemingly never-ending battle against organised violence. I hope you found that useful. If so, here are some more videos that you might find interesting. Thanks so much for watching, and see you in the next video.